don't have to speak very loud because it's a nice, intimate gathering. Welcome, everyone. After 2 years, we finally have some live events at Politics and Prose. And welcome to the streaming audience. Welcome. My name is Andrash. I'm the music buyer at our main store on Connecticut Avenue. I also got a chance in September of 2019 to go on the Périgord trip that Sheila Campbell organizes. I really had the time of my life there, seeing Lascaux, going to vineyards, and having Martin come and do some out-of-this-world tour guide duties. It was incredible, and to host us for a fabulous lunch. So one reason I wanted to do this introduction is to thank Martin personally and his wife Julia. They were fabulous hosts. It was a spectacular trip, and it really does make the books truly come alive. I've read all of them. Do yourself a favor and immerse yourself. Do the deep dive. Let me just say a couple of housekeeping rules. As you see, we've given out index cards for questions. I'll collect them and I'll read them, and Martin will fabulously answer them. You can talk about Bruno. You can talk about current politics. As you know, Martin was a correspondent for The Guardian, UPI, and spent time in Russia as a correspondent and has written several books about Russia. He told me he just got a very special award from the Alliance Française as a contributor to French culture, following the lines of Julia Child, Francois Truffaut, and who's the third? Yeah, Pierre Cardin. So illustrious company. Congratulations. You definitely deserve it. So as I mentioned, Sheila's leading another trip to the Périgord in June. The trip is sold out, but there is a waiting list. So whoever is going, you're very lucky. I guarantee you'll have the time of your life. We have signed books. Martin has already signed. They're up front and available. I think Bruno's challenge would be a great gift for people who really never read the Bruno books, just as a little intro, a little bonbon, just to get a sense of what the world of Bruno is about. Wanted to tell you about 2 other books of Martin's that are coming out. His last Bruno book was The Coldest Case. That is coming out in paperback in July. And we... No, not at all. Politics and Prose had a really nice Zoom interview, conversation between Martin and his New York editor, Jonathan Siegel. That's on our web YouTube page. I highly recommend that conversation. And then the newest Bruno book, To Kill a Troubadour, is coming out August 9th. So look forward to that. We were just talking a little bit about that. As you know, Martin has written 16 Bruno books, so great correspondent. You remember him from the Diane Rehm show, as having great political insight. And that's, I have a lot of other things to say, but I'll cut it short. And please help me welcome, live and in color, Martin Walker.
Well, that reminds me of an event in Israel, a conference in Israel where I was one of the speakers, along with your former president, Jimmy Carter. And he was given an absolutely extraordinarily lavish introduction. And he got up and he said, I'm so sorry my parents weren't here to hear that, because my father would have enjoyed it and my mother would have believed every word. So, I know a bit how he feels. Thank you very much. Very generous introduction. It's a bit of a strange thing to be introducing a collection of short stories, because I never thought I would write any short stories. You probably know that for many writers there's something intimidating about writing a short story. I mean, I think it was somebody once said that I don't have time to write short stories because it's so much tougher to do than a novel. And the interesting thing about the Périgord is that it's got so many points of inspiration that one can pick up on, from the food, from the wine, to the medieval history, the prehistory, the tradition of the local culture of the Occitan language and of the troubadours and so on. It's not widely known, but the Inquisition by the Catholic Church was not born in Spain. It was born in southwestern France in the Périgord, where the Pope declared the Cathars, who were kind of proto-Protestants in a ways, he declared them to be heretics, and he announced the Inquisition to go in and root them out. And this was the time when one of the French abbots, who was besieging a town called Béziers, said, when was told that many of the people in there were Catholics, they weren't just Protestants, he said, kill them all, God will know his own. So pretty rough times, folks. And but I love sort of delving into all of this French history. And one of the ways that I got to know more and more about it was not just reading, but by joining some years ago the local history society, the Société archéologique et historique du Périgord, and it's now 150 years old. And this gave me an idea for one of the stories in this collection that I really, really feel very pleased about. Because I begin it with the mayor challenging Bruno for the special anniversary dinner to try and cook some kind of Neanderthal gourmet meal, which might sound impossible, except that over the past 10, 15 years, we've been living through a revolution in archaeology, and it really began with DNA studies, when we were able to trace back much more deeply how that there had not been a genocide wiping out the Neanderthals. In fact, all of us in this room have between 2 and 4% Neanderthal genes in our bodies, and that there have been found now traces of bones of children who had both a Neanderthal father and a Cro-Magnon mother, and that was one thing. Then the second thing was that the scientists managed to be able to take the plaque from the teeth of ancient skulls and analyze it and get hold of the DNA of the food that had been eaten in the course of that plaque accumulating. And we all traditionally, just as we always thought in the past that, I was certainly brought up thinking, Neanderthals, brutal cavemen, low foreheads, prognosis of semi-ape-like. Far from it. I mean, the Neanderthals had bigger brain cases than we did and could well have had slightly larger brains. And we now know that they were technologically very developed. They'd invented rope. And one thing that was a bafflement to the archaeologists for years was a kind of a bone which would have several holes drilled into it. And what we now know is that was how they made the rope. They were feeding fibers through each of these holes and then twisting them when they came out to make a kind of a rope. And we found that because of a large piece of clay that actually had a tracing of the rope upon it. And the archaeologists were able to date it to about 50,000 years ago. So it's really quite something. And what they found when they were analyzing the plaque was that we probably all thought Oh yes, they used to gnaw mammoth bones, and they used to eat sort of shoulders of venison, and well, actually no. Their diet was very much more complicated than that. It began really with archaeologists on the coast at Arcachon, the big bay quite near Bordeaux, and they found a midden, a rubbish heap, a rubbish pit of the Cro-Magnon people, in which they were able to track traces of seaweed, which had clearly been partly gnawed. And moreover, in that seaweed, they found quite a lot of tiny shells of sea creatures, of a kind of sea snails, and they found that in some of the excrement as well of the people. Then they began looking inland, and they found that quite near where I live, they found a pond there, and yes, there was quite a lot of waterweed there, or riverweed, duckweed, if you like, and they'd been eating that too. So we then think, well, what more do we find? And we found that they were eating quite a lot of turnips, because they grew naturally, wizened, thin little things in the day, but nonetheless turnips and parsnips, and this duckweed, but also on the riverbanks you find quite a lot of river plants which have rhizomes. That is like a big fat root, and it's very much like a potato, nutritionally, and in the ease of cooking, and in the quality of the calorific benefit to it. So Bruno, having done his research with the local archaeologists in Les Aisies, he thinks, well, maybe I can put something together here. And then he hears from one of the archaeologists that they've just found what they think is the world's oldest oven. And they think it's about 35,000 years old. And in fact, it's one of 3 ovens. This is at a place called Sergent, which is just up the River Vézère, quite close to Saint-Léon-sur-Vézère. And there's a whole series of caves there which were inhabited for quite a long time. And what they found was, in the riverbank, which was very heavy clay, they found 3 cylindrical holes, each of about 2 feet deep. And these holes had been repeatedly recovered with moist clay after they'd cracked. In the bottom of the holes were several rocks, basalt rocks, which don't crack under the influence of fire, and then a lot of wood ash at the bottom. And my wife and I remembered that when we were on one of our vacations, we were in Bali, and at a place called Ubud, which is in the center of Bali, in the middle of this wonderful monkey forest, there is a very fine Buddhist stupa there as well. We actually had a meal that was produced in an oven, much like this. That they had the hole, they put in the rocks, they built a fire, then they wrapped a duck in wet banana leaves, put it on top of the embers, covered the hole, and we came back a few hours later in time for dinner. So this is what Bruno decides to do, and this is in the story called Birth Neanderthal. And one of the problems, he thinks, how can I make a sauce to go with the venison or with the beef? And because we know that the enzyme that we need to break down cow's milk and cow's cheese wasn't developed until just a few thousand years ago. So, but he thinks, well, they have birds. Birds have nests. They could get eggs. They could have egg yolks. They had berries, which you could make a kind of a berry sauce on the venison. And he produces this wonderful meal. And also the mayor then comes along with a little bit of an extra, which is the world's oldest wine. Now in Georgia, formerly Soviet Georgia in the Caucasus, we know that they had the world's oldest vineyards, something like 9,000 years ago, and they used to make their wines in great big clay pots, which they buried in the ground. And the grape that they used was called Saparavi. And when I was based in Moscow, I went down to Georgia at every possible excuse, because it was a lovely place, great food, terrific wine, and it was very different from the Soviet Union, to the degree that in Tbilisi they were very proud of the fact in the train station But they would say, the train now leaving for the Soviet Union is departing from platform X. So in recent years, we've had more and more trouble with climate change and wine. So 20 odd years ago, when I was drinking Bergerac red wine, it would be 12 and a half, 13 degrees. Well, the wine is now, or the grapes are now ripening 2 weeks earlier than they used to. And for the whole of the Bordeaux and the Bergerac, this is a big problem. All of our red wines are a blend of Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Malbec. And if you pick these grapes when they are ripe, that doesn't, the grapes are full of juice, but they haven't had time for the phenols and the tannins to develop. So if you leave it for another 2 weeks to allow the phenols and the tannins to develop, those grapes are just bursting with sugar, which means bursting with alcohol. So a wine that was 12.5 degrees is now 14.5 or 15 or even 15.5 degrees, which means you get drunker faster. And so we've been experimenting with various kinds of different kinds of grape. Among them, I am very pleased to say, is Saperavi. So the mayor brings along a couple of bottles of Saperavi wine so that they can have a really prehistoric drink as well as a prehistoric feast. So I had great fun doing that particular story. I also had fun doing another of the stories, which was called Lost Boy, about a family that's having a picnic, and the little boy, as the mum and dad are sort of sorting out the picnic, little boy wanders off into the woods, disappears, can't find him. Dad goes looking, falls, and breaks an ankle. They call Bruno, and Bruno is, or they call the local police, and Bruno is actually with a young woman who is a real estate agent who is showing him the first drone to arrive in the Périgord, which she wants to use to take photographs of the stately homes and chateaux that she's trying to sell. So Bruno ropes her in with her drone to see if that can help. But mainly he goes with his dog, his basset hound, Balzac. And Balzac has got this wonderful nose. And so they get some of the boys' clothes and off Balzac trots. And Bruno's a bit nervous because he knows we are now in wild boar country. And wild boar can be, well, they can run at about 30 miles an hour for short distances. I don't know if you know this, but the way basset hounds traditionally were used in France was to hunt wild boar. Because although they can't keep up with the boar's sprint, the bassets can lope along all day. And so they run the boar ragged until the poor boar is exhausted. And as the boar's head sort of drops down, a basset comes in from either side, grabs a foreleg and pulls. So the boar is locked face down and immobilized, and then the hunter comes along with the boar spear and finishes the job. Anyway, so Balzac comes across a couple of young mocassins, which is the name for a young boar, a baby boar, and the big old tusker is somewhere nearby, and Balzac just makes sure that his presence is noted rather than appearing threatening. And the old tusker calls the young mocassin, and off they go. And Bruno then finds the little boy who had been trying to play with the little baby boars. And Bruno takes them all back, finds the injured husband, family is reunited, and they're very sad because they had a booking to go to the Lascaux cave, which they had to be cancelled because they couldn't get there. And so Bruno tries to think, well, what can we do so the holiday isn't really spoiled for this family? And he calls his friends at one of the nearby caves called Fond de Gome. And Fond de Gome is an extraordinary cave. It's a painted cave. I love it for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a place where we finally were able to be pretty sure that the painters, the artists, were not all men, and that women were also part of this, which is an idea I first came up with in my The Caves of Périgord novel. And the reason we know it is because in various parts of this cave there are palm prints, clearly done by the people involved in the painting because they're using the colors, exactly the same clay colors that were used in the painting. And some of them are male, and some of them are grown-up women. But then lower down are children's palm prints. So you can get this image of the kids sort of playing around the parents' feet while mum and dad are up there doing the painting. And that to me is a very touching thought. But on top of that, in this cave you will find a number of quite small, beautifully, delicately done, beautifully drawn images of reindeer. And particularly there's one of an elderly, wounded or dying reindeer which has sort of collapsed down on its knees, and another, I presume a female deer, because there are no horns, and she looks very attractive. And she is leaning down and licking at the head of the stricken reindeer. And it is one of the most touching scenes. It's about 20,000 years old. And the great thing about the caves there is you walk into these caves and you recognize at once this is the same aesthetic that we have today. We respond to these visual images that they are creating, whether the power, the majesty of Lascaux and these giant bulls, or whether it is something as small and as perfect as the reindeer of Gome. So I adore all of this stuff, and I was able to get in the Gome paintings into this story about the lost boy. The other thing that really annoys me when people sort of talk about cavemen being primitive, I mean, the technologies they developed. People never used to seem to ask themselves why it was. The main cave, the Hall of the Bulls in Lascaux, is about the size of this room. And the ceiling is almost as high as this ceiling. How did they get up there to paint it? They had to build scaffolding. You couldn't have built scaffolding without having developed rope. It just wasn't possible. And on top of that, so many of the caves are deep underground, and most of them are limestone caves, so the walls are pretty much white like this, and the ceilings as well. How did they see? How did they get light to paint by? Because there was no natural light coming in. And they developed the only technology that would give them light without the kind of smoke from a torch that would darken all of the walls. And what they found was that they developed handheld lamps, which were stones which had declivities sort of carved into them, and they filled that with rendered reindeer fat, and they used as a wick, a twig of Geneva, of the Genièvre, of the Geneva plant, which is the plant that goes into gin, for example. And that gives you a clear light without any smoke at all. And without that technology, because that's what it was, they couldn't have produced Lascaux or any other of the painted caves. So I was cured, really, of any thinking that these people were primitive. They had the same inventiveness, I think, that we did, the same artistic, aesthetic sense that we did. And they really are our ancestors, and they are us. And when you look at the beauty of some of the stone tools and the bone tools that they produced, it's also quite awesome, or quite awe-inspiring for me. Another of the stories which I really enjoyed researching and doing was about a story called The Collaborator, about a man accused of having been a collaborator in World War II. Now, this is a live issue still in France. It's not just the fact that I know a couple who had to elope away from our area because his parents had been resistance, or his grandparents had been resistance people, and her parents had been collaborators. And I heard from my neighbor, Joe, who was a farmer, and who got a medal for, as a little boy, having been a resistance courier, that on the day that our small village of Lebugue was liberated, several people were marched out from the town hall, from the mairie, lined up on the bridge, the stone bridge, which you will be seeing if you come with Sheila to the Périgord, and they were just shot and the bodies pushed into the river. There was something called the épuration sauvage. That is the purification, the wild, the savage purification in the time of the liberation when so many old scores were settled. Next village up the river from me is a place called Le Buisson. And there, that was a regional center for because it was a major rail interchange between the north-south, the east-west line. They had a permanent group of Vichy police there, the sort of the paramilitary police guarding the place. And these police were the ones who had to authorize the issuance of rationing cards. Now bear in mind that after 1940, until Germany was liberated, the Germans had something like 1.5 million prisoners of war, French soldiers, in prison camps in Germany, who were there pretty much as live hostages for good behavior on the part of the French government. In other words, 1.5 million, or well over 1 million, young French women mothers were dependent upon getting these force mobile gendarmes to authorize the ration books to feed themselves and their children. And human beings, what they are, some of these gendarmes were particularly nasty types who demanded sexual favors in return for the ration cards, which would allow the mothers to feed their children. And although there wasn't a bridge where they shot people, two of these gendarmes were kicked to death by the women because there was no shoes in those days. Their leather was short. They were wearing wooden sabots, the clod of clogs. And the thought of being kicked to death by a crowd of angry women wearing wooden clogs is really quite something. Anyway, so I was really struck when earlier this year, we had next month, we have the French presidential elections. Macron is running again, and one of the really surprised candidates who's emerged is a journalist and commentator, a guy who'd be right at home on Fox News, called Éric Zemmour, who made his name with a book called La Suicide Française, the French suicide. And the theme of it was le grand remplacement, that the French people were about to be replaced by Arabs and Islamic people and blacks, and it was an extraordinary racist tract, but it sold over 500,000 copies, and now he's done another version, an even more historical version of the book, which has sold almost 1 million, and which is a huge number in France. And he's a candidate in his own name, and he's getting between 12 and 18% of the vote, depending which poll you look at. And he brought up this whole tradition of the collaborationists and the resistors when he was trying to defend Marshal Pétain as a real savior of the great old French tradition. And among other things, he said, Pétain gave Hitler just the foreign Jews in order to save the French Jews. And first of all, it's a disgusting thought, but secondly, it's not even true. I mean, an awful lot of French Jews finished up in Dachau and Auschwitz and Ravensbrück and Buchenwald and so on. Anyway, so I wanted to get into this thing of what is a collaborationist. You have to realize that until June of 1941, there was virtually no resistance. For a whole year after France fell in June of 1940, the only sign of resistance we had was a tiny little group of intellectuals in Paris who were putting out some duplicated magazines and had almost no impact. June of 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union, at which point the entire French Communist Party is recruited to go into the resistance. And for most of the war, the FTP, the Francs-Tireurs et Partisans, which the free shooters and the partisans, was the name of the communist resistance. And then in early 1943, after Britain had won North Africa after the Battle of El Alamein, and the Americans with Eisenhower and Patton had landed in Morocco, we'd taken the southern shore of the Mediterranean, we were planning the invasion of Italy, and then the Soviet Union, the Soviet Red Army, had won at Stalingrad and surrounded and destroyed the entire German army. So at that point, French people began to think, maybe Hitler's not going to win this one after all. And a lot of people began steadily shifting their allegiance, one of whom was François Mitterrand, later France's president from 1981 to 1995. Mitterrand had been in the French army. He was taken prisoner, escaped from his prisoner of war camp, and in 1942, in the spring of 42, he got a job working for the Vichy government. And he was working there in an office that was meant to be supplying aid and support to French prisoners of war. And by the end of 1942, Mitterrand had begun making his connections with resistance types. Early in 43, he flies to London, meets de Gaulle. Later in 43, he flies down to Algeria and starts to build up the resistance. And after Jean Moulin, who was de Gaulle's representative to the resistance to try and unify the communists, the Gaullist resistance, Mitterrand begins to take over that role. And so Mitterrand, for many people, for most of the left, Mitterrand is a Johnny-come-lately to the resistance, and he was a collaborator for a while. And I wanted to explore this whole issue because I remember one of the great sons of the Périgord, the diplomat and former bishop, Talleyrand, who was Napoleon's Grand Chancellor. He was Napoleon's Foreign Secretary. He was the man who betrayed Napoleon after the defeat in Moscow and began making the contacts with the Prussians, the Austrians, and the British to be sure that there would be an easy transition to bring back the Bourbons. And whenever he was accused of being a traitor, Talleyrand would say, "Treason, my dear, is really just a matter of timing," which is pretty much what I think about the collaborationists and the resistance in World War II. And so I invent a young man, a schoolboy, who writes an essay in the late summer of 1940, in which he's saying that we have to sort of think about the possibilities rather than the horrors of this defeat. And maybe this is a time where we can really start building some kind of Europe. We do need to collaborate in our rail systems. We need to collaborate in the way we're going to organize our economies, da-da-dee-da-da-da. And basically, it's a rough blueprint for what became the European Union. The German foreign minister, Ribbentrop, read this, or was shown it by his staff, because he wins a prize that's organized by a local newspaper for this essay. It's shown to Ribbentrop by his diplomats, and he seizes upon this idea and starts organizing conferences around it and invites this young man to various meetings, not just in Paris, but also in Germany, and introduce him to the Hitler Youth, and you'll get on very well together, and so on. So this boy becomes like a poster boy for the collaborationists. The guys who take him up in Vichy are delighted that there is this young man putting out ideas that in effect would say, yes, we're going to get a new Europe out of this. And one of the guys who is, I love this, one of the guys who is taking him up is kind of the house intellectual of Vichy, a man who had been quite well known in the USA in the 1930s. He'd been at Harvard, spoke and wrote English very well, wrote for various American publications, and he was also the guy who translated Gertrude Stein, her poetry, into French. And if you want to know why it was that Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas were able to live in occupied France throughout World War II and never were touched or harassed, even though Gertrude Stein was Jewish, it was this man, Bernard Gailly was his name, and he was the one who protected her. And then when Bernard Gailly is arrested by the resistance in 1944, and he's thrown into jail, Alice B. Toklas hires a criminal gang to do the jailbreak that got him out. And Gailly then was able to move to Switzerland and carry on his career as a translator and poet and so on. I mean, you couldn't make this up. You couldn't possibly make this up. So I mean, the idea of being able to sort of bring this kind of stuff into one of my stories, I just love doing it. Now, there's all sorts of other stories in there as well. I mean, there's in the opening story, Bruno's Challenge, I've invented a restaurant, which you will read about in many of the other Bruno novels, called Ivan's. And Ivan is, his menu depends on his love life. You know, he begins by producing your classic French bistro cuisine. Then he goes on vacation and meets a Spanish girl on the beach. And she comes back with him and is helping him to cook. And so paella and dolce cum leche start to be on the menu. And everybody in Saint-Denis is delighted with this. And then they'll have a row, and she stalks off to the station with her suitcase. And everybody thinks, oh dear, no more of that nice Spanish food. But then he goes back, he goes on another holiday and comes back with an Austrian girl. Wiener Schnitzel, it's terrific. And so, and then everybody's really fascinated. Where is Ivan going to go next? Can we persuade him to go down to Thailand or Southeast Asia? When he comes back with a white girl, hearts sink a bit, but she's an Australian, and she loves cooking Malaysian and Thai food, so there we all are tucking into the... But the thing is, it doesn't exist, this place. I invented it. I get so many tourists coming up and saying, where do we find Ivan's restaurant? Anyway, so this the first story, which is called Bruno's Challenge. Ivan is in the market shopping for a big dinner he's doing that night. It's a golden wedding anniversary dinner for a couple that have been married for 50 years. And they've got the entire extended family, 30 people for dinner. And as he's shopping, Ivan has a burst appendix and is taken off to hospital. So as he's being put onto the stretcher, he says, Bruno, you've got to stand in for me and do the cooking of this meal. And I'm sure all of you know that it's one thing to cook for 6 or 8 people, but to cook for 30, that's why we have professional chefs. That is a really, really difficult thing to do. But Bruno rallies together various friends like Gilles and Pamela and so on. They sort of eventually manage to put this meal together, and it's really quite a good meal, although I say it myself. I had great fun dreaming up the menu and also picking the wines that would be going with each individual dish. And I do recommend those wines. If you find yourself going to this region, the wines that I'm mentioning in that particular short story are ones that I strongly recommend that you get. And by the way, Sheila, you have to, if you're doing a vineyard visit, you're going to have to visit a place called Château La Fayole. It's not far from Aimé. It's a wonderful old building, a wonderful old chateau, dating back partly to the Middle Ages, but it's run by a terrific American couple who've only been there for about 3 years, but they're making wonderful wines, just won a gold medal at the Paris Fair, at the Paris show, and they're also doing wonderful lunches on the terrace outside their terrific tasting rooms, and you look down to the small lake where they have some pedal boats for kids to dart around in and so on. And they're a really, really nice couple. They're called Frank and Ricky Campbell, and I strongly urge you to take your people there. So now, I did make a list of, because I can't keep track of all 14 of the stories. Oh yes, there's one of the stories is called Dangerous Vacations, and it's about a young woman who thinks that the American tourists ought to have a special tour for them to focus upon the links, the American links that there are with the Périgord. Now, many people know that the origin of your White House here in Washington, D.C. was based upon the design for a chateau up by Terrasson, because although it's a different color, it's a rather dowdy gray rather than your nice white. It is exactly that same scene that you see with the big curved balcony at the rear and so on. Then also there is Thomas Jefferson. If you go to one of the chateaus called Ruffignac, you will find there the library in which Thomas Jefferson wrote a number of letters and pamphlets. And he was there because just across the river is Chateau Fenelon. And Fenelon was something of a hero to Thomas Jefferson. Fenelon was a young priest who became interested in the education of girls and got a reputation in France for these courses that he was running so young girls could be as skilled in Latin and in mathematics and so on as men that they were aspiring to marry. He was then hired to be the tutor of the Dauphin, the heir to the throne. And the throne at that time was occupied by Louis XIV, the Sun King. And to try and give a sense of what he was trying to do, Fenelon wrote a book called Telemachus. Now, Telemachus was traditionally the son of Ulysses in Homer. And Fenelon writes the story of a mentor. The word first comes with him. A mentor, a character called Mentor, who is teaching this young Telemachus, this heir to Ulysses' throne, teaching him how to be a good and just and wise, fair king. And it's heavy reading these days, but it became the first real European, trans-European bestseller that was not the Bible. It appeared in something like 180 editions across Europe, in every language you can think of, in Spanish, in Italian, in Polish, even in Russian, in English. And we know that Thomas Jefferson's library contained 4 copies of Telemachus. And he went down to this part of the world, not just because he liked the wine of Bordeaux and the Bergerac, but also because he was making a kind of intellectual pilgrimage to Fenelon's chateau. And then, of course, there was the Lindbergh family, who settled just near Audrix, where they opened a research center into apes and monkeys. And so then there was the Percy Pink, as they were called, which was the group of American paratroopers who in July of 1944 landed to try and help the resistance just at about the time when the resistance had liberated the entire area. Thank you very much. But they were so pleased to have real live American paratroopers that they could show around, look, we have our own American liberators here, that it became a very important thing. So among the things that she's doing is trying to give an American flavor to the Périgord. And then she finds her car, her van that she's taking people around in, being sabotaged by a young woman who seems to think she is a rival for the favors of Philippe de la Rente, the young reporter for Sud-Ouest, who is sometimes a thorn in Bruno's flesh, but sometimes he can make use of him as well. I do love writing these stories. There's one birthday lunch which is about a birthday for Florence and her children. There's an awful lot of food in here. There's an awful lot of wine as well. One of the stories I really enjoy is called 50 Million Bubbles, where you will learn the truth about champagne. Those snobs up in the Champagne region of France, in northern France, they are cheating you. 15 years ago, they doubled the size of the area of Appellation Contrôlée. That is to say, the land on which you can produce a white wine that you can call champagne, a sparkling wine. So overnight, the amount of bottles of champagne being produced increased by over 100 million bottles. Wine that you were able to buy as ordinary sparkling wine for like 3 or 4 euros a bottle, you could suddenly sell for 15 euros a bottle. No wonder that particular local deputy has been re-elected overwhelmingly ever since. And also, it's not as though champagne was invented in Champagne. It was invented in southwestern France by a Spaniard called Dom Pérignon. And in an abbey in southern France called Limoux, he invented the méthode champenoise, which is how you create champagne. You actually do the fermentation inside the bottle. And in order to keep stirring the lees, you have to turn them every few weeks. He invented all of this, and he invented the way of having a cork maintaining, staying inside the bottle, despite the fermentation of the gases that was rising, by having a wire wound around them. And so he was the father of Champagne, and nothing to do with the Champagne district. They just stole the name. Brilliant piece of marketing by the Champagne people, but you'll learn the truth about champagne. In this one, where called 50 million bubbles, which is the number of bubbles you can expect in a bottle of real champagne. And the people of the town vineyard of Saint-Denis are trying to make their own version of champagne with the 50 million bubbles. There's an awful lot of food and drink and history and a lot of, I think, a lot of enjoyment in this. So thank you very, very much. Come and use this one.
Great, great. I'll say that Martin's wife, Julia, gives such expert recipe making that you can cook all the recipes in the book or make the mulled wine. That's also the star of one of the stories. So it's a very interactive book, I would say. I would also recommend the book Martin mentioned, The Caves of Périgord, which he wrote before the Bruno books. If you haven't read that, it's got tremendous research from Martin's many interviews that he did with resistance fighters and his very, very just bringing to life the artists of the caves. And you'll see the little seeds that became some of the themes of Bruno later on. Here's a couple of questions that are related. How did Bruno learn to cook, and when is the cookbook coming out in English?
The cookbook comes out in English next year. It was to have come out in September, but as you know, there's been this real crisis over printing facilities and paper shortages. So lots of books have been delayed, including my cookbook, or my and Julia's cookbook, and God bless the Americans, because we could never persuade my German publishers to put Julia's name on the cover at the same size as mine. But that's happening with the book that's coming out next year. And it's entirely just and fair, because Julia really did so much of the work. She cooked all of the dishes that are photographed, and she wrote down all the recipes, and I just wrote the twiddly bits in between the recipes, you know, and so it really is, well, it's her book, I think, in so many ways, and I'm totally proud of her. And if you like this kind of food writing, if you go onto Substack and put in the name Julia Watson, you will find she's writing a weekly column about food, which I find very, very good. The other question was? How did Bruno learn to cook? He pretty much taught himself, and because he was living alone when he first arrived in the Périgord, he was doing, and he's an old soldier at this point, he was cooking not particularly well, but as he joined the local hunt club and found himself dragooned in to help do the whole local hunt club dinners when we roast entire wild boar or entire venison and so on, which we also do at the tennis club. And we have lots of lunches and dinners at the rugby club. So before every match there is a lunch. I mean, going to the rugby match in my village, you know, you get there at about 12 o'clock for the little apéro, the first drinks of absinthe or whatever it might be, or Kier or whiskey, and then we will have lunch until 3 o'clock when the game starts. And we are doing the cooking ourselves, so it's something that certainly helped me become a cook, because we did the same thing in the tennis club. I would be playing gentle doubles with guys of my age on the Friday morning, and then we'd go to the tennis club building itself, where, of course, this being France, the biggest room is the kitchen, and we would produce our own lunch and bring along our food and cook it right there. I learned an awful lot about cooking in the course of that, and that was how Bruno learned to cook. So 2 of the letter writers will be going to the region and just want some advice. And one of the questioners asked about the website, which is called brunochiefofpolice.com, and it has a lot of recommendations. It gives you restaurants, hotels, wines, vineyards, all the caves.
all of Martin's recommendations. It's a very
a section called A Perfect Week in
yes,
Périgord,
yeah,
what to
yeah.
see
It's
and
it's very very detailed, and there was a specific question about the Le Bouge Sarlat markets. Will they be, excuse me, will they be open in June?
oh yes, yes. In fact, I'm rather sad because I had to miss the Truffle Feast in January at the Sarlat market, where we have a very big event. And yes, the market kept on going even throughout all the worst of the lockdowns of COVID. The market in my little town of Le Bouge carried on going with a great gap between each individual stall and little sort of red ropes to keep people separate and so on, but the market carried on. I mean, it takes more than a global epidemic to stop the French market, let me tell you.
Here's one. It just says, spoiler, question mark, will Bruno find love?
Well, he already has.
Yes.
He found love with Isabel, and
Yes.
one of the points, I'm not sure if it's, I think it's in the book that comes out later this year, in which he tells himself that, well, he's always told himself that the women to whom he's attracted are strong, independent, spirited women who want to build their own lives, and some of them just don't want to get married and raise children. And Bruno is aching to find a woman with whom he can settle down and raise children. But as long as even a sliver of his heart remains attached to Isabel, he feels he can't fully give his heart to anyone else. But things start to change, because in the book that comes out later this year, To Kill a Troubadour, remember Florence, this woman with the 2 children? I mean, I cannot tell you how many letters I have had from readers that say, why doesn't Bruno settle down with Florence? He's already a kind of a substitute father for her children, and she clearly adores him and so on. And now, this is where Julia becomes important. Now, Julia, this is my wife. We've been married over 40 years. She is still an awesome woman, and not just a terrific cook and so on, but she is responsible for a lot of Bruno. Because when I wrote the first manuscript, I called my hero, I think I called him Gaston as a French name, because I didn't want to call him Pierrot, which is the name of my local policeman, who was really the inspiration. And Julie said, you can't possibly call him Gaston. You have to have an international name, because you might be selling it internationally. So how about Bruno? That works. And then she said, now, you might have something here with this first manuscript, but publishers like to think there might be a series. So go away and write 5 paragraphs, one for each of the next 5 novels in the series. Yes, ma'am. And you know, Julia was entirely right, and so she is very much the sort of the co-creator of all of this. And I've lost the thread of my thought about what the original question was. Love. Oh, love. Well, Julia, whenever I get a problem, I said to Julia, I'm getting all of these letters from readers saying, you know, why doesn't he settle down with Florence? And she said, my dear, the moment that Bruno marries, you will lose half of your readers. So I take this very seriously. But things start to change a bit in the novel that comes this year, because remember, Florence divorced, 2 little children, 2 twins. Her husband reappears out of prison. Ha ha!
Question about Mitterrand, which you brought up. The questioner wants to know, was his conversion to the resistance opportunistic or ideological?
I think a bit of both. Mitterrand was sort of very, very centre-left for most of his career. That is to say, I mean, pretty much I count myself as a social democrat in the European sense, and I believe in free healthcare and free education and so on and so forth. Probably make me a dangerous radical in the US, but this is you know, just like Obama tried to do free healthcare and so on, and Clinton. But and I mean, besides, it is insane. You're spending 18% of GDP on health in this country. We spend 9% in Britain. We've got better life expectancy, better infant mortality than you do. I mean, you are paying through the nose for a lousy product. Sorry. Okay, yeah, I'm sure you all know this. Anyway, so Mitterrand was, I think, pretty much a centrist, slightly sort of left of centre, but he was always able to make alliances. And so he made alliances with the communists in the course of World War II with their resistance fighters, and he also made it again to win the election in 1981 against the incumbent president, François Giscard d'Estaing, who everybody expected to be re-elected. But Mitterrand made an alliance with the Communist Party, who at that time had about 30% of the vote in France. And that was what put him into the Élysée as the new president. And as a result, he put various leading communists gave them jobs as ministers. Basically, he hugged the Communist Party so close, he crushed them to death. Because by the time Mitterrand left the Élysée in 1995, this 30% of the French voters that had been communist had become something like 3%. So he was a very cunning political operator.
A couple of people just had comments. One person said that Bruno's garden reminded them of their grandfather's garden in Nebraska. Another person wanted to know if you'd seen Jefferson's library at the Library of Congress. Perhaps to end, we talked briefly about rugby and the fact that Martin still is very involved. He just told me about an upcoming singing debut. Perhaps you wanted to mention a couple of those.
After the Olympics last year, we had a wonderful celebration party because one of the girls in the French women's rugby team was a young girl who had been trained by Pierrot, our village policeman, and by me. And her team had just won the silver medal at the Olympics for women's rugby. So very proud of that. Then I'm flying back to Europe on Monday because I have something extraordinary to do. I'll be making my debut singing at the Berlin National Opera House in Germany. Now, I will not be singing opera, I have to stress. It's their jazz week. And I will be singing various jazz kind of things. It all happened by accident. There was a literary festival in Germany, and I was a person who was meant to do the after dinner presentation. And so a certain amount of wine had been taken, and I was feeling pretty jovial. And so when the name of a song came up, one of Jacques Brel's song, La Chanson des Vieux Amants, I thought, well, what the hell? And I sang it. And it turned out to be a very popular move, and people then began demanding that, when I went on readings in Germany, I was expected to do a song at the end of it. And then I got to know a local sort of German jazz rock group and began performing with them. And so we're going to be doing next Saturday and next Sunday evening, I'll be on the big opera stage singing Kurt Weill and a bit of Jacques Brel, Cole Porter, Irving Berlin. Bis sur nous zooment les orages, 20 ans d'amour, c'est l'amour folle. 1000 fois tu pris tes bagages, 1000 fois j'ai pris mon envol. Mais chaque meuble se souvient, dans cette chambre son berceau, des éclats des vieilles tempêtes. Et finalement, il nous fallait bien du talent d'être vieux sans être adulte. Oh mon amour, mon doux, mon tendre, mon merveilleux amour, de l'aube claire jusqu'à la fin du jour, je t'aime encore, tu sais, je t'aime.
Bravo, bravo. Merci.
I always say remember what Dr. Johnson said about seeing a dog walking on its two hind legs. It's not that it's done well, it's that it's done at all. Right.
Thank you so much. Bravo. And merci. And as I said before, signed books are available at the front. Caves of Périgord we'll have at our main store, Connecticut Avenue. And I don't need any Marvel Cinematic Universe when my superhero is Bruno, Chief of Police, and Martin Walker. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you, Martin.